Namaste and welcome. So the talk for today is going to be a little bit different, but I hope you still find it interesting anyway. So for a lot of us, when we start chanting or start this process of bhakti yoga, we come across in Kirtan, we come across an instrument that we maybe never saw it before, or we have seen it but we've never played it, we don't know much about it, the Harmonium. So my spiritual master, Jagat Guru Siddha Sarupananda, he personally plays a harmonium, and sometimes at Kirtan he will ask somebody there, one of the devotees, play a harmonium please. So it's part of Kirtan, isn't it? Of course, Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, he was quite renowned for playing the harmonium. So you might be forgiven for thinking that the harmonium has been around for a very long time. You might even have just supposed that when Lord Chaitanya, Lord Nityananda, when they would go to Srinivas Pandit's house each night to the courtyard there to have kirtan, that there would be, yes, there were drums, madanga, yes, there were cartels, but yes, there was probably a harmonium there as well. So you'll be very interested, hopefully, to hear about the history of the harmonium. So that is why I've called this talk tonight the birth, the death, and the reincarnation of the harmonium. So let's begin this journey now with the birth of the harmonium. And we're going to begin in 1779 in Denmark. And I'm going to read to you some of the history. I've condensed it to really just a short class, but let's listen to the history of the harmonium. So the prototype for the harmonium was designed by Christian Gottlieb Kratzensein. I know I'm going to get slaughtered for how I pronounce that name. He was a professor at the University of Copenhagen, but he was not a professor of music. He was a professor of physiology, and he used to do experiment with the effects of electricity on the human body. I find that quite strange, but anyway, that's what he did. But he also had a love for music. And he was particularly fond of a Chinese instrument called sheng. This is a Chinese free reed instrument shaped like a vertical pipe that was brought from China to Europe by Marco Polo. So when in 1779, the Academy of Science at St. Petersburg in Russia, they offered a prize for an essay on the formation of vowel sounds on an instrument similar to an organ. Once again, I find that quite strange, but there you have it. So our professor, who was inspired by the Chinese instrument, Kratzensein, built a small pneumatic organ fitted with free reeds. And thus the first harmonium type instrument was made. So this is the beginning. This is the birth, okay? This is the newborn. And he presented this to the Academy and he won. So over the years after that, because he only made a prototype. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't selling his harmonium type instrument. So over the years that followed, there were a number of European gentlemen who would build similar instruments to his. But actually it wasn't for another 60 years, in 1840, that Alexandre Debian, okay, I'm going to get slaughtered again for the French here, Alexandre Debian of France, he patented his instrument which he called the harmonium. Okay, it's officially arrived now from this French inventor. His harmonium had a foot-operated bellows beneath the keyboard. So we can see it starting to take shape of what we know nowadays. And this harmonium that he's developed became actually an important instrument in folk music in Scandinavia, in Finland, and other European countries. So let's move forward a little bit now in this story of the harmonium, the journey of the harmonium. When Europeans immigrated to the United States, they brought the harmonium to their adopted country. And soon, it was so popular that American firms began manufacturing the instrument. So these harmoniums that were being produced now in America, they achieved their peak of popularity in the 19th and early 20th century. It's just a small window there really in history, isn't it? But small churches and synagogues that couldn't afford those expensive pipe organs that we see in the big churches, they loved the harmonium. It was something attainable that they could purchase and they could provide for their small churches and synagogues. In fact, if you attended church, your regular churches 150 years ago in America, very likely you would have heard church music or even classical music played on a harmonium. These harmoniums were lighter in weight and smaller in size than those big organs, and therefore they were easy to transport and less liable to be damaged in transit. So they're very practical. As a result, Western classical musicians began composing pieces specifically meant for the harmonium. So now we have the harmoniums in churches, synagogues in America, as well as back in Europe, still being played over there. But in America, many reasonably affluent families, so they're not super rich or anything, but they would buy one of these harmoniums to place in their homes, in their living rooms, because you've got to remember back in those days, there probably was not even any radio at the time. So what did families do after they had their evening meal? They would sit around, maybe they would read a Bible. There wasn't really that much that they could come together as a family and do in the evening. So here it was, the harmonium. They would learn how to play it and it would become part of their evening. But now we're going to move along. It wasn't just the middle-class families who were purchasing these harmoniums in their homes in America. The rich people didn't want to be left out of this entertainment, and so they would have harmoniums in their houses. So the harmoniums even then started to become part of, the tuxedo and the beautiful gowns and diamonds entertainment sort of thing. So it's really spreading out into society, into their churches. So the poorer people who went to the churches would be hearing the harmoniums, middle class and your richer people in society in America. And probably the final step then from the harmonium in America, the final part of its story was that it began to be used for patriotic music. Ta-da-da-dam! So for, that national feeling of American, they would play the harmonium with their songs. So there you are. It's really interwoven throughout the whole fabric of American society, really, in one way or another. Now, one of the interesting things about the harmoniums that they had was that heat and humidity didn't affect the harmoniums as much as they did pianos, because pianos are actually moving them around is difficult. You've got to get them tuned up again and things like that. And they're actually like pieces of furniture, aren't they? Solid pieces of furniture. But here was a harmonium that they could use instead of a piano. So in America, and it was also happening in England and Europe and that, the different colonies that these Western powers had in the tropics, they would send harmoniums to them. And so the harmoniums then went to Asia, to Africa and the Caribbean. Wow, so now it's going everywhere all over the planet, isn't it? Starting up in Denmark, spreading everywhere. Oh, so let's now listen to the death of the harmonium. The harmonium's decline began in the early 20th century. Why did this happen? Why did it decline? It was so popular and so practical. Well, changing tastes in music meant it was no longer popular as a household musical instrument, and harmoniums became increasingly more and more expensive as a result, because the less people who buy them, the higher the price it's going to cost. And then the less people who buy them. It's just, dog chasing its tail sort of thing. But the really knockout blow for the harmonium in Western countries was in the 1940s, when the electronic organ was invented. That was the death of the harmonium. The electronic organ, it had a larger musical range. It looks spiffier, and it really took off. And nobody wanted a harmonium in their house. They wanted an electric organ. So it was really the death of the harmonium in the Western world. So let's now look at the last part of the story, the reincarnation of the harmonium. While the death of the harmonium was happening in the West, the portability of it and its heat resistance meant that the British could export the instrument to their colonies for their homes and their churches there. So for the British homes in foreign lands, for the expats, they could have a harmonium. In India, the Far East Trading Company had been very concerned that their English civil servants that they sent there, that were stationed there, were becoming influenced by Indian culture and religion. In fact, many had married Hindu ladies, they'd given up eating meat, and they wore local clothes. And when they met up with each other, a common parting was Ram, Ram, with folded hands. By the 19th century, the company believed it was paramount that they stop this. You see, the problem was that they'd sent their British employees to a country that had a deeper history, deeper answers to questions. And some of those people were starting to really appreciate what India had to offer. But this was no good. This was not going to happen as far as the Far East Trading Company was concerned. So they sent marriageable English ladies to India, as well as sending all sorts of paraphernalia, books, all sorts of things to keep their homes Englishified. And they sent harmoniums, because remember, harmoniums are Western. So they sent harmoniums to India. By the mid-19th century, because of the Indian revolt that took place, the Far East India Trading Company departed, were finished. That was the end of them, really. But they had sent harmoniums. Also the Portuguese traders who came to India, especially down the southern part of India, they also brought harmoniums because they would set up their churches down there. So the harmonium had really well and truly arrived in India, but it was just seen as something to do with foreign countries. It was not Indian in any way. But the Indian musicians, they discovered this instrument and they understood that they could use this instrument for Indian music. So let's see how that develops now. There was one particular musician, Dwarkanath Ghose, whose company, Dwarkan & Sons, was a leading manufacturer of musical instruments in Calcutta. In 1875, he designed his own version of the harmonium for the Indian people. And it was a hand harmonium, an instrument that was like half the size of the European harmonium. And it was pumped by hand with hand-operated bellows located at the back of the instrument. Now, this was revolutionary with the design of the harmonium. This new incarnation, we'll call it an incarnation of the harmonium. This new incarnation of the harmonium, it was more durable, it was less expensive to build, and it was easier to maintain and repair. All very practical things for India. Ghose simplified the internal mechanism of the instrument and added drone stops that would render it suitable for Indian classical music. Because remember, up to this point, the harmonium was used for Western music, European music. A scale-changing mechanism was added later on, and moreover, Indian musicians traditionally sit on the floor, don't they? So this new style, new design of a harmonium was perfect for just sitting on the floor. It was all working out brilliantly for the Indian musicians. But the fundamental difference that made these adaptations possible was that Western music is based on harmony and Indian music on melody. Interesting, yeah? Therefore, it was quite feasible to pump the bellows with one hand and play the melody with the other. You did not need both hands on the keyboard. Like a piano, you need both hands, right? So it's really starting to develop and come together now. So now the story is going to take a little bit of a downturn for a little while, because in 1905, Bengal was partitioned into East and West by the British. So anything British or foreign was rejected by Indians, and the harmonium was put into that same basket. The harmonium became a target. In fact, there was an anti-harmonium movement that arose, and some Indians called it a Frankenstein monster that would inflict harm upon Indian music. The popular all-Indian radio station even banned the instrument from its airways. From 1940 right up until 1971, no harmonium music was allowed to be played on that popular radio station. But the harmonium was not without its champions as well. And some very famous Indian singers chose the harmonium as their instrument of choice. So this really softened the Indian people. Okay, maybe it's okay, because these are very iconic Indian singers that, you know, are choosing to have the harmonium there. And the harmonium, it was discovered very early on that it was excellent for group singing. So you had the Hindus and the Sikhs, and even some small Muslim groups who would use the harmonium for their bhajans, for their Kirtan. So now we've got the harmonium really being appreciated and coming into the whole Kirtan movement in India. And the Christians are already there. The Portuguese, the English had set up Christian churches throughout India, and they didn't lag behind in their use of the harmonium. They used it to sing hymns in Indian languages, really just as the Europeans and the Americans had done on mainland years beforehand. So they were incorporating it in their churches now as well. So the harmonium developed a reputation as an instrument of devotional music in 4 religious traditions on the Indian subcontinent. You had your Hindus, your Sikhs, some Muslims, and the Christians. They're all using the harmonium now. That's quite amazing, really, isn't it? So the harmonium became popular really across a wide spectrum of music. So it was in their churches and temples. There they had iconic Indian singers having harmonium playing, and it went into folk music. And different states of India have different folk music, and of course North Indian classical dance. They started to have harmoniums as part of the instruments. So this is really starting to take on all of India, isn't it? But there is one part of Indian society that we cannot forget when we're talking about this journey of the harmonium, and that is Bollywood. So in the movie industry, they embraced the harmonium, because they have all those musicals, Indian musicals and that. And so they had the harmonium featured in that music. And of course that went out, everybody loves their Bollywood songs and everything over in India. So by 1915, India was manufacturing its own harmoniums, of course, because they had redesigned them all, and they actually became the world's leading producer of the instrument. Meanwhile, the European harmonium was dead and extinct, and it's only found in antique shops, museums, and in the homes of collectors of musical instruments. So it's dead to the rest of the world, and it's really coming alive in India. But let's continue the story now, that this harmonium, which is really starting to be seen not as a European instrument anymore, it's being seen as an Indian instrument, it now comes back to America. And this happened in the first half of the 20th century when you had Indian migrants going to America and they're taking the harmonium with them. So it went to India from Europeans, and now it's coming from Indians back to America. This fascinating journey. But the cream on top of the pie for the story of the harmonium was in 1965. Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada journeyed to America. When he first came there, in the beginning there, he would chant and he would have kirtan, and he would just have a little pair of cartels, sometimes a drum. He would play a drum. But as he was gathering together these young, enthusiastic Westerners to this hearing and the chanting of Krishna's names, he began to organise the kirtan. And he wrote in a letter in February 1968, "My idea is that at least 12 persons should form a kirtan party. 2 persons play madangas, 8 persons play cartels, 1 person plays tambura, and 1 person plays the melodious harmonium." So there you go. So the harmonium now became established as an instrument of kirtan in the West. So nowadays you can go online, or there's various ways of doing it. You can purchase a harmonium, whatever country that you live in. Usually they're still manufactured in India though, but they're all different colours. You can get them, and they're different sizes, bigger harmoniums down to smaller portable harmoniums. There's quite a lot of variety there. So we've discovered that the harmonium was just beginning to be used in Kirtan in India approximately 140 years ago. That's all. It's really, for Kirtan, that's its history, is in the last 140 years, even though it was about 230 or 40 years ago that it was the first prototype came into play. But musical instruments, whether they're cartels, they're drums or harmoniums, or they're a newer addition like electric guitars and so on, they're always to be understood to be just an accompaniment to Kirtan, because the heart and soul of Kirtan are the mantras. It's not the instruments, it's the mantras. So the Vaishnavas are always aware of this and careful with this. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in the late 1880s, so if you look at that time span, this is just when the harmonium is starting to be used in India, amongst Indians. So they would bring along sometimes a harmonium to the Kirtan, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur observed that a lot of people, their attention would go on to the instrument, because this is very new to them. And they'd be watching the harmonium and they'd be listening to it, and they're not listening anymore to Krishna's holy names. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, at that point in time, he forbid harmoniums to be used in Kirtan. For that reason, they were distracting away from what Kirtan is, the hearing of the holy names. Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada also, even though he introduced harmonium into Kirtan, he was very careful that it too did not become louder or more distracting than the holy names. And our spiritual master, Jagat Guru Siddhasarupananda, on a number of times he's told the musicians not to let their instruments, the sounds from the instruments, become louder than the person who's leading, chanting Krishna's names. Krishna's names are the heart and soul of Kirtan. So if we consider that in the next 100 years, the next 1,000 years, the next 10,000 years, however far you want to go, Kirtan with the timeless holy names, which will have been passed on from the hearts of the pure devotees. These kirtans will be still taking place, but who knows what kind of instruments will be accompanying the holy names. We have no idea, because here's an instrument that's just come about in the last 140 years. But the potency of kirtan is not found in any musical instrument. It is the heart-to-heart connection of the kirtan leader with his spiritual master, the pure devotee of Krishna. That's Kirtan. Namaste, everybody.
Krishna. Give me some harmonium. May the sweet names of Krishna spread throughout the universe and bring peace and happiness to the hearts of all. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Chant the names of Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna,
Louder. Hare Bol. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.